Well, I have to give you a health warning, first of all, because if you buy this book and you sit down and open it, you will lose your whole evening. You may lose a night's sleep because you will not stop reading it if you're anything like me. So well done, Steph.
Thank you.
You didn't expect to be here today. This was not your life plan.
No.
Can you take me back to when you had the conversation with Andy about having a fourth child? What was going through your mind in terms of your vision for the future at that point?
Well, so, yeah, we had, my husband Andy and I had 3 beautiful children, Theo, Xanthi and Jules, and we always wanted more than 2. And it was kind of, do we have 3 or 4? And I like even numbers. And we kind of did the sums. Oh, yeah, come on, let's have 1 more. And the plan was eventually, I was juggling a very full-on marketing career. Andy was juggling a very full-on career in management development. And the plan was to eventually reduce my hours a little bit and just enjoy time with our kids. And, get on with it, really.
So when did you realise that it may become a little bit more complicated than that?
Slightly more complicated. So I went for my first scan at 8 weeks. For those who've had babies who've been pregnant, they do a Nuchal fold test, which looks at the chance of having a child with Down syndrome or one of the trisomies. And we'd had that before with the other children. It'd been a kind of 1 in 13,000 chance, because I was still relatively young. I was 36. But the doctor came in and told us we had a 1 in 4 chance of having a child with Downs. And I think I practically fell off the bed. My first thought was, oh my God, I've ruined the kids' lives. I just didn't know what to think. Really didn't. And in fact, we scheduled an amnio, and I had the amnio, and we went on holiday. So I don't know what we were going to do, but we had a phone call to say that the child that I was carrying didn't have a trisomy and didn't have Downs. What I didn't know then was that was only one thing that they could even test for. Whether they told me or not, I don't know. Didn't even hear that. So I was just relieved. And then I just said, am I having a boy or a girl? And I was told I was having a little girl.
So you had Daisy. Daisy arrived.
Yes, somewhat prematurely, which is typical Daisy. That just kind of, let's make your mark, Daisy. So she was due on Valentine's Day in 2005, but she was born on the 22nd of December 2004. And by cesareans, my child before had been born at home, a natural water birth, so, couldn't get more extreme. And from that moment onwards, my life changed. To be honest, I'd been in hospital for a while before with Daisy, in and out of labour, and quite poorly myself. But 22nd of December 2004 was really when I think I did look at my husband and go, oh, was this in the plan? So, yes. And that marked the absolute turning point and has really led me to where I am here today.
So what can you tell us about the condition that Daisy had?
Right, so Daisy was found, although she was about 2 months premature and not terribly small, but quite ill, and was then found to have this condition called Costella Syndrome, which is caused by a completely random, sporadic gene mutation. And we've actually been told that it's a 1 in 1.25 million chance of a child having Costella Syndrome. So it was nothing to do with it. It was kind of total Euro Millions lottery odds. So we did win the lottery with Daisy. Again, like many syndromes, there's a continuum. So we've met some people with Costella Syndrome who are in their 40s and are working and living semi-independently. Whereas in Daisy's case, there were a lot of things going on, from being partially blind, she had a learning disability, she had complete intestinal failure and was totally dependent on intravenous nutrition, multifocal epilepsy. I mean, you name it, heart condition, she had it. Everything that had been written about Costella Syndrome and some, Daisy had it. But on top of all of that, she was still Daisy and amazing.
So you're a planner, Steph. So you're given this information. What was your plan at that point? What did you expect? And what services were available to you? Who did you get to talk to? How did that all unfold?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing to realise is that I had this baby And, you know, I was kind of traumatised from a birth that I wasn't expecting.
And you missed Christmas.
I missed Christmas. I spent my
Family.
first Christmas with Daisy. I was pretty poorly in hospital. She was in intensive care. I was at home with the 3 children. So, you know, and I was full of hormones and, you know, pain drugs and all sorts and worrying about my little girl. But I think the most important thing was I was parachuted into a world for which I'd had no prior experience, knowledge, training. So my background is marketing, and you know, in my career I was pretty much at the top of my game as a marketing professional. I knew a lot about marketing. I knew nothing about the NHS services, social care, health and social care, nothing. So I was, you know, I had this massive learning curve to negotiate, and I realised pretty quickly on that I needed to negotiate that learning curve pretty quickly because I was Daisy's advocate, and it was down to me to make sure that she had everything she needed to be able to thrive. So I had to learn a new language. I mean, I didn't even know the difference between what was a phlebotomist versus an SHO. It was literally that basic. And then, you know, my daughter had this really rare condition. I had to educate myself on her condition and then how to navigate the services that she needed. So there was one thing being in hospital, but then there's another thing completely once you get home. And the thing is with Daisy's condition, which I think I've completely glossed over, is that she was life limited. I mean, we were told that it was unlikely she was even going to make her first year. So I was also mourning, because I was mourning a child that I thought I was going to have, because we thought we were going to have another little girl. And, you know, until she was born, we really didn't know what was going on. Growing to love this little girl who was incredible and fighting, but then going through anticipatory grief, knowing that she was also going to die very young. So I had all of that going on. I had 3 kids who were 7, 5 and 2. My husband, who was then trying to earn money for the 2 of us because I had to give up my career. And then all these people just descending on me. So when we came out of hospital, people coming to the house, portage, early years, social workers, children with disabilities team. And I didn't know, you know, who was useful, who wasn't useful, and, you know, how to make the best of everything that was available or not available, what was available.
And how did you get introduced to the Children's Hospice? It was Shooting Star Chase,
Shooting
wasn't
Star,
it?
yeah. So we were so fortunate, and I absolutely maintain that in the lottery of life, Daisy scored well. And we scored well because we live in a lovely suburb of southwest London with great access to Great Ormond Street Hospital and a fantastic children's hospice. And then within a few weeks of Daisy being in the neonatal unit, our neonatologist took me to one side and said, I think you're going to need some help, Steph, when you get out of here. And I was floundering, didn't have any family nearby, and she framed it so well. The whole referral to hospice, to palliative services, was about support and was about help in navigating and walking beside us. So Daisy was referred and actually started with support from the hospice from the age of 6 months. And that was so crucial, and that made a massive, massive, massive difference to our entire lives, not just Daisy's life, but my other kids' lives, because they had access to sibling services, and mine and my husband's life. And I just felt I wasn't alone, that I had someone there walking beside me throughout this magical mystery tour that I was on with Daisy.
So I'm struck that when we spoke, you were telling me how exhausted often the hospice staff would be when they would come out and see you, or you'd do some respite.
Yes.
And it might be 8 hours of care because Daisy was very complex, could sometimes be very challenging because of the medication she was on. I'm struck with how it was for you 24/7 and how it was for Andy juggling a job and then looking after your 3 kids as well. Can you give us some insight as to what it was like when everybody else went home?
Yes. I mean, this is what I talk a lot about now in the work I do around communications, and it's what I was passionate about talking about with medical professionals, because I used to say to them, you know, you're amazing, you're Team Daisy, you're supporting us, but you can go home. And we live this 24/7. And people say, but we've sorted out respite for you. Yeah, but really, it's never respite. You never, ever, ever switch off. So I think I spoke to you, we got some respite, and I love festivals, so we went off to Glastonbury. And I'm walking through a field in Glastonbury about to go and see, I don't know, Killers on the main stage. And I'm on the phone because the hospice has just phoned because they've dropped the last bladder syringe that is needed to flush Daisy's bladder. And so I'm talking the hospice nurse through how to get into my house and what cupboard I kept all the syringes in. That was my respite. And my respite was then also spent either ordering the stuff Daisy needed or literally being on tenterhooks for a call. I remember once Daisy was staying in the hospice for a respite stay, and it was my birthday, just pouring a glass of wine, just thinking, Anne, relax. And the phone rang, and one of her lines had come out, and it's an emergency situation, and I had to just bomb down the road and meet the ambulance and get to hospital. So yeah, I mean, and then also respite was so that I could just be a mum to my other kids. It was never just time for myself. And, let alone our relationship, my marriage, my husband and I were very much ships that passed in the night. And we used to parent by rota. One would be in the hospital, another would be at home looking after the kids. And we kind of, just WhatsApp each other instructions.
We put a lot of time and thought in hospices and palliative care into training and make sure that everybody is well trained and up to date with everything. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a flavour of the sorts of medical procedures that you were carrying out and the training that you had? Yeah. Because when I talked to you about Hickman lines and stomas, and it sounded incredibly complicated.
Yeah, it is, and I think this is the thing, and I think particularly with children and young people that are complicated and have complicated conditions, it almost happens quite insidiously, the level of skill that you take on. So, and it was all about getting Daisy home. So all we cared about was enabling Daisy to be part of the family and be home. So, she left the neonatal unit with an NG tube. That's like, it's easy. And I learned how to pass the NG tube, easy. Gastrostomy, and then she was on a pump. And then gradually she developed intestinal failure. So then eventually she had a double lumen Hickman line that was permanently connected to a TPM pump. And I would spend about 2 hours in the morning before she even went to school drawing up IVs, infusions of all the meds she needed, 2 blue trays worth. I used to photograph them because I was so proud that I could do this. Me, with my degree in anthropology, I could do 2 blue trays of IVs and get them all set up for Daisy. She had a Roux-en-Y jejunostomy. This terminology, it's like, how did I learn all of this? And this was to enable us to put a few meds in that she could still absorb. Her gastrostomy by then was on free drainage and draining bile. She had an ileostomy with a stoma bag attached that would drain because it was high output, and then a mitrophonophstoma, and that's so rare, that was permanently catheterized, that so many nurses, would not come across that in their day-to-day experience. So I would find myself sometimes, if Daisy was in crisis and we were in A&E, and if there wasn't a nurse available who could access a Hickman line, I would be accessing Daisy's line to take the bloods to check whether or not she was septic, and this would be in recess in A&E. That's the level of care that I was delivering or giving to my child to enable her to be at home. And as I say, it just happened insidiously. You just trained to do these things just so you could be out of hospital and back home. But definitely once I was at home, the support and that level of knowledge was not there, because it was my job to know all of those things. But our community nurses certainly didn't have the regular skills and experience of managing and caring for a child as complex as Daisy.
And you were shattered because you're doing this 24/7, and there's nobody to check that you're administering the right levels of drugs, and you're half blind with tiredness. Did you ever make a mistake?
Yeah, I mean, that was my biggest fear. I lived in huge fear. I used to say to our social worker, sleep is a human right, but also on a ward, you would not have nurses working back-to-back shifts, and you would not have nurses administering ketamine or morphine or midazolam without checking a dose with someone else. And I didn't make a mistake. I lived in absolute total fear of making a mistake. But there was a time when Daisy's TPN pump broke. And again, on a ward, a nurse would be coming in and checking the TPN pump constantly. And the TPN it's an intravenous infusion. It goes directly into the bloodstream, via a central line at the tip of which rests in the heart. So, you know, if that goes wrong, there's all sorts that can happen. You know, the child can become septic, bleed out. But what you don't expect is the pump to break, which is what happened at home. And I was so tired, I was so busy doing everything else, I didn't check the pump, and Daisy went into a hypoglycemic coma. And for want of a broken pump, we nearly lost Daisy. Yeah.
And you're totally focused at that point that you're trying to prepare yourself that you're going to lose a child.
Yeah.
You're exhausted, Andy's exhausted, you're not looking after your own health. What then happened to Andy?
So then, so basically, and I think this is the thing with carers, you live at a level of exhaustion that becomes normality, and with adrenaline pumping, that becomes normality. So Daisy would take us to the edge with sepsis, and then we'd be like, whoa, she's back again. Okay, back to the routine. And you're so busy then looking after your child who's sick, or the person you care for, and your other children, that you just don't look after yourself. And Andy was, in October 2014, he lost weight, a lot of weight, very, very quickly. And initially he was really proud of it. We just got this dog. I was like, oh, it's brilliant. It's the best thing, because you're taking the dog for a walk, you're getting fit, you're losing weight. And then he lost 2 stone, and that's not right. And he was found to have stage 4 colorectal cancer. Incurable. When it was found, it was everywhere. And you know, in hindsight, we look back and we realise that tiredness, was that just tiredness from caring? Actually, no, he was severely anemic. But you just don't see it. You don't see it. So now I was dealing with the fact that not only was my daughter going to die young, and Daisy was deteriorating, becoming sicker and sicker. Her epilepsy was really out of control. She was on 24-hour intravenous nutrition. You know, things were really deteriorating. She'd lost the ability to walk. And I was facing the fact that my husband was also dying.
So as a family, you're having to balance working with adult palliative care and children's palliative care.
Yeah.
What did you see as being the main differences? What surprised you going into this new world?
Huge difference. So Daisy had been referred, so obviously she'd been referred to the hospice very early on, and then within Great Ormond Street, once she was in complete intestinal failure and it was clear that she was on a downward trajectory, she was referred to the hospice the hospital palliative care team, and they liaised with the hospice. And what was great, again, that was framed as symptom management, and because by then Daisy was on this kind of polypharmacy of, you know, ridiculous amount of drugs, and the palliative team framed it in terms of getting on top of all of this, managing the symptoms and enabling Daisy's quality of life. So we had a long-term relationship and built up really good relationships with the key players within the palliative teams, both at the hospice and the hospital. With Andy, palliative care only came to the fore in the last 2 weeks of his life. And it was all framed as, there's nothing more we can do now, and it's end of life. And we had, when Andy was diagnosed, because we were already living in a world where we knew that life was finite, that we knew that our daughter was going to die young, it was, obviously it was upsetting, you know, my husband was going to die young, but we didn't need to make that transition to, you know, life is finite. But we weren't able to have those conversations about, well, how do we optimize that quality of life? And it was only because we were living that way that we did things in that final year we had with Andy. So we did have a final trip to Glastonbury, and we made most of those precious moments. And I often say this when I speak, we realized, Daisy taught us that the small things are really the big things. So we made the most of just time together, sitting on the sofa, sitting around the table. But managing Andy's symptoms, managing the sickness, managing the fatigue that comes from chemo and radiotherapy, that really just didn't happen in the same way as it did with Daisy until he was absolutely end of life. And it was almost kind of the oncologist kind of went like this and said, right, over you go now to palliative, there's nothing more I can do. So there was a stark contrast between paediatric and adult palliative care.
So you lost that connection with the team that you trusted,
Yeah.
and moved on to a completely new team
Yes.
very, very late on.
Yeah.
I'm also, I'm interested to know how you helped the kids cope. I mean, you would have presumably put your feelings right to the back to try and help everybody else. But So your sons would have been prepared, or you would have been preparing them to lose Daisy.
Yes.
All of a sudden you've got to prepare all of them for losing Dad.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's the thing, when you're caring as well, and particularly caring for a life-limited child or a husband who's terminally ill, you do almost bring kind of the barriers down so that you just go into autopilot to do the things you need to do. But I'm so aware that I had these 3 very vulnerable young people as well that needed to, and they'd grown up with Daisy and with the hospice and going to siblings days. And Jules, my youngest, was 2 when Daisy was born, so he knew nothing prior to life with Daisy. I do also need to add in that so I've got 3 other children, 2 boys and a daughter, and the 2 boys both have high functioning autism because I kind of like layers and layers of complexity in my life. But when Andy was diagnosed, I actually contacted the specialists at the Children's Hospice to ask them how to talk to the boys and to Xanthi about their dad dying. And their advice was, you have always been very, very open and honest about Daisy and her prognosis. You can't change that now because those kids will smell her out. And my kids, absolutely would. So we chose to sit down with them each individually and communicate with them in the way that they needed to be communicated with. Interestingly, with Theo, I think I took him out for a drive because having Asperger's, doesn't like to make eye contact, and he needs distraction. But we were really open, and we didn't use euphemisms. You can't with autism. You can't say, going to pass away, going to go to a better place, because they will get completely confused. So we were very open, but we were also very open about, look, we just don't know how long Dad's got, because there is actually what we learnt as well. There is no timescale for prognosis. Daisy was defying the odds. We thought she was going to live for a year. And Andy, had this terminal cancer that potentially could have killed him within a few weeks. As it was, we got 13 months. So we just, we didn't know, but we were really open. And then with Daisy had a learning disability. Again, we talked about sometimes, and we had to use kind of learning disability language. Sometimes people have a poorly that sometimes the doctors can't fix. And that doesn't mean that we can't fix your poorly, but sometimes, we can't fix things. And it was quite a difficult one with Daisy, but she was very, very aware. We didn't hide Andy's illness from her.
Do you think Andy tried to stay alive long enough to see Daisy through it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked about this a lot. And I think that was the one thing that we actually couldn't talk about. It was just too upsetting, and we were very open as a couple and had very open conversations, and we had a great evening. We were planning his funeral over a bottle of wine, but that was the one thing. It was talking about the fact that I was going to be on my own when Daisy died, and he really, really wanted to just be around long enough. So for the kids to be that little bit older. Jules was 12 when he was diagnosed. Daisy, it was just a couple of weeks before her 10th birthday. So they were so incredibly young, and we were so acutely aware of that. But, what can you do? Cancer does what cancer does. And, the treatment worked, and he didn't regret any of the things he tried. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
So Andy died. And then pretty quickly afterwards, you had to make the decision about when enough was enough for Daisy.
Yeah. So Andy died at home. He wanted to come home. We have a fabulous hospice nearby, St. Raphael's, but the outreach nurses came to us, and he died at home. We gave him what we feel was a good death. And then that final year, so he died just before Christmas. Everything happens in our lives just before Christmas in 2015. And a week before Daisy's birthday again. And then she really deteriorated over that final year. And it's really obvious to me how much you need to be mentally in the right place to fight. I hate that competitive language, but it is about fighting. She had shingles, she had sepsis, and your head needs to be in the right place to be able to deal with all of that. And Daisy's wasn't, and she was really deteriorating. And I remember that Christmas, it was the first Christmas after Andy had died, because we hadn't buried him. We had Christmas and then we buried him. So I always feel that the following Christmas, 2015, was sort of the first Christmas after he died. And I remember thinking, are we playing God here? Because I was doing so much to care for Daisy, but that window of quality of life was really closing. And that's the thing where medical science can do so much, but sometimes you wonder, are we doing too much here? But Daisy took things into her own hands, and she went into Great Ormond Street, and she was overcome with sepsis, absolutely overwhelmed, and was ventilated. And we were told that really there's nothing more that can be done. So I had to make the decision to end her life support. So I called the kids to her bedside because it was really important that they also were involved and had the choice for how much or how little to be involved, but also could see that we were doing the right thing, that this was Daisy's time. My middle two decided to sit in a parents' room, and there was a fantastic Muslim chaplain. So just sat with them, just as an adult. My kids are atheist, but I was so appreciative that this adult was just with them at possibly the worst time. And then Theo chose to be with me, and we gave the nod to the intensivist, and we switched off the ventilator, and she took just 2 breaths and died.
You talk a lot about communication because you're really keen to stress how important that is. And one of your recent articles was, "Don't call me mum."
Yes, so if those of you that read the BMJ, that was, I'm really proud of that. It's only a small little piece. And to me, it's so screamingly obvious. And I over and over and over meet healthcare professionals that actually say, that didn't occur to me. So for me, if you think about it, prior to my life with Daisy, prior to the 22nd of December 2004, I was top of my game in a world that I knew, and I was respected, and I had a seat at the table as Stephanie Nimmo, marketing professional. And then I was Daisy's advocate. And I felt I just as much deserved a seat at the table at multidisciplinary meetings and all these different conversations that we had about Daisy. But often I would find that, people go around and introduce themselves and they go, "This is Mum." And I feel so disempowered because my whole experience, my 24/7 living, 2 blue trays of IVs, remember, was being condensed down to, this is Mum. And yeah, I love being Mum, but I'm mum to 4 people. There are 4 people in this world that can call me Mum. So the SHO that chased me down the corridor that I write about in this BMJ article, about to tell me actually that my daughter was legally blind, shouting, "Mum, Mum," even though he had my daughter's notes in his hand with my name on the front. I just, for me that was a really triggering moment. And I basically, my feedback to healthcare professionals is just ask people what they want to be called. Senior citizens might not want to be called by their first name. They might be addressed as Mr. or Mrs. Conversely, parents often would prefer to be asked, what would you like to be called? And in my case, I'm quite happy to be called Steph. And some people are quite happy to be called Mum, but it's about this mutual sort of respect for what everyone brings to the conversation and that we all deserve a seat at the table.
When have you had a chance to grieve?
So I mean, obviously when Andy died, I was left with 4 kids who were grieving on my own, a single mum, shell-shocked. And also, we were on benefits. So, Andy was ill and he had to give up work. So, I was just kind of struggling to just keep my head above water. And then Daisy died. And then I didn't have to, and I had to make sure my kids were in the right place. And then eventually it kind of struck me that I need to be in the right place too. I need to give some time to myself. I had a really silly car accident last year where I was running around. So what I was doing was masking by being busy. And that was kind of, so I didn't have to deal with it all. And I had a silly car accident that triggered a lot of memories about hospitals and things. And that's when I engaged with therapy, which is the most important thing that I do now in my life so that I can process everything that's happened to me. And then also the most important thing is writing and communicating and talking about and trying to make some meaning out of all of this through the work I do. But yeah, but grieving is one of those things. It's, I actually don't believe in those 5 stages of grief because, 1 minute you're doing really well, next minute it's like, bang, you're right back there as if it only happened yesterday. and it just hits you at different points in time. So my dad died when I was 32, and that's 19 years ago, and I still have moments where I just feel so desperately sad that he's not around. So I think grief is just an ongoing thing, and I think we're just not very good at talking about all these subjects, all these taboo subjects, death, dying, grief. And I think particularly in Western culture, people are expected to have a stiff upper lip and get on with it. So as you know, you follow me on Twitter. So sometimes if I'm having a really rubbishy day, I'll just put on Twitter, I'm having a really rubbish day, and I get some Twitter love and I feel a bit better. So, and I just, people know me, I wear my heart on my sleeve, and I just say to people, talk about it, be open and find your way of expressing your grief and your feelings.
So we've got an audience full of hospice and palliative care people, and we've got people watching on live stream as well, and we'll be watching later on video. What would you like to say in terms of what could we do better?
I think the thing that worked really well, if I'm thinking about palliative care, was introducing the concept of palliative care very early on for Daisy, and then also not framing it as giving up, but framing it as walking beside you, supporting you, and focusing on living a good quality of life for however long that life is. So what I then experienced with Andy, where palliative care was framed in terms of there's nothing more we can do, end of life, that was almost too little too late. And I think there's two ways of doing it. Professionals being brave enough to have those difficult conversations and reframing the way we talk about palliative care. But then also us as just human beings being a lot more open and talking about these difficult subjects and asking the questions. So it is ultimately the thing I'm most passionate about. It comes down to communication and effective communication, and having those conversations very early on.
Well, we've got a few minutes, so I'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions. Can we have the lights up slightly so we can see when people are putting their hands up? And we've got some roving microphones around as well. Does anybody have a question for Steph?
I do always find that actually after I talk, everyone's a bit shell-shocked. They don't say, I'm sorry. But those of you that know me know that I am very open and no question is off limits. So, yeah.
You have a question? I'm going to do this.
Oh. We'd like to keep Andrew running around.
That's it. Get my fingers in.
Thank you, Steph, for sharing your amazing story with us. I think it's really sad to hear that your local palliative care services for your husband were offered so late. I'm just curious if there had been the opportunity for you to reach out to your local adult hospice or adult services and not wait for a professional to recognise the need and the potential. Do you think you might have been in a position to do that? Would that have been any benefit to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. That's never occurred to me, and I think that's a really good point. Because I was aware of how the children's hospice service worked because of my involvement with them. But had I been able to think that I didn't need a referral, that I could have reached out, that would have been really valuable, because we in our family understood the benefit of hospice services, and we understood that it wasn't about giving up. So even when Andy was diagnosed immediately and told that he was terminal, once we picked ourselves up off the floor, we were literally like, right, practical, how do we deal with this? So we were in that mindset, and it would have been really helpful to have had the support, because one of the things I found really useful, particularly with Daisy's hospice, it wasn't just the practical support, but it was the signposting to other services and also meeting other people. All of those things are so crucial so that you don't feel on your own. So I learned so much about what's out there and the availability of services through other parents, for example. And, talking to, as you gather, I talk a lot. So, talking to people, you learn about all of the different support services and voluntary services and things that can be accessed that could potentially be of benefit. So yes, I think that's an absolutely brilliant point. And had we known, had we even been aware that we could have done that, we probably would have done that, yeah.
Any more questions?
Just one. The title of the book is Was This in the Plan? Another plug for Steph's book. So do you have a plan for the next few years?
People often ask me that.
Doing?
There is no. I've learned now. So you know, when I met Andy, and in fact I've been in Belfast working. So I don't live in Belfast. So I was introduced coming from Belfast. I live in London, but I was in Belfast doing some work with Will to Give, reframing some of this whole narrative around death and dying. And I was asked, you know, if you could go back to that moment in the pub in Canterbury where you first met your husband and someone told you what was going to happen, what would you have done? And I'm like, oh, I'd run a mile, who wouldn't? Because in those days, you know, it's kind of, as you do in your 20s, I think, oh, I'm going to have a house, I'm going to live in London, I'm going to have 3 or 4 children, I'm going to have a great career. And then it all starts to go wrong. And what this has taught me is that I have resilience that I just didn't know I had, and we all have, because people often say to me, oh, I'm not like you, I couldn't do it. But you don't know, because I didn't know I could do it. I am just an ordinary woman that just was thrown in some pretty extraordinary circumstances, and I'm trying to make the best of them. But no, I don't have a plan anymore. I'd like to take advantage of opportunities that are sent my way, and you know, I'm building a new career and doing some really great things, and who knows what I think having Andy and Daisy particularly has taught me is that life is finite. You know, when I give my talks, I always stand up and say the only thing we have guaranteed in life is we're all going to die. So that's the only thing that I know I can plan for, is I'm going to die. Everything else, well, let's just make it up as we go along.
And I'm sure there'll be some more books in the pipeline
There
as
are.
well.
Well, there is another book. So there was Goodbye Daisy, which is not available in the bookshop, but they said they can order it at a discounted rate should you so wish to buy it, which is a book for children about death and doubt, and particularly children with learning disabilities. And there is another one that I'm pitching at the moment to agents. So yeah.
Well, the very best of luck with it. Can we show our appreciation, please, for Steph? Thank you.